The podcast is 6 years old this year, and what I thought I would do to mark the occasion is a host Q&A. Some people have submitted both Quo and non-Quo related questions to me, and hopefully I can answer them to the best of my ability. In some cases, I got more than one question from an individual person, and what I'm going to do here is just answer mostly one per person. I've selected the ones that I think I can answer in a relatively short amount of time off the cuff. So let's start with Dan, who says, if you could go to any point in the Quo universe, when and where would you go? Well, Dan, that is a great question, and I think it has many answers, because of course you'd say somewhere in the 1970s, perhaps the recording of the live album, to see a visual to that iconic sound. And basically anywhere there. I'd be very interested in seeing the late 60s, just before they changed their direction. You know, what was their stage show like? They have some bootlegs out there, but they're not exactly of great quality. It gives you an idea, but what did the show visually look like compared to later? I wouldn't have minded being at, if I could jump in a time machine right now, probably Butlins in Minehead in 1990 for that gig, simply because the visual representation that we've got at the moment with all the graphics and stuff kind of ruins it for me in retrospect. So to see that, warts and all, would be great. I mean, most answers to this question are going to be a gig at some point in time. Greg asks, what is your favorite guitar solo on a Quo record? Now, Quo went through various different eras. The 70s stuff, there are a lot of solos that I really do like. There's obviously the Backwater Just Take Me stuff. I mean, that is iconic. The one that jumped to mind the moment that I read that question was Don't Think It Matters, because to me, that middle section of da 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 da, that bit just epitomizes the Quo sound, when the rhythm section are just hot on it, really tight, and then Rossi goes on, not like a rock and roll, lick or whatever. It's melodic. It's got a tune to it that you can kind of hum to, and it's really effective and catchy as well, to the point where even now, like, it's playing in my head. They're extremely memorable. Saying that, I do like, and I know my dad was a huge fan of, when they did what you might call more like Chuck Berry typical rock and roll style solos, like the one on Carol from Just Too Late, where he's doing some rock and roll licks, obviously, that go with the song. And then there's that bit in the middle of the solo just before it goes into that last section, that sort of bit there. And there's just something about the way that the music changes in that section that just rises it up. It's just such a feel-good feeling, especially as the whole track itself is very high tempo and possibly one of the best covers that they ever did. In terms of the 1980s, I really like the end of Rock and Roll. Great melody on the solo at the end of that, just lifts the rest of the track up, makes it memorable. And personally, I really like In Your Eyes from the In the Army Now album. It's not a typical Quo track. That's probably why I like it, because anyone who's ever said all Quo songs sound the same, I love all the production flourishes in there. It's just great. But the solo in the middle, okay, it's okay. But at the end, as they're coming out of the track, and you hear "Dream of You," and you hear Rossi go, "Come on, yeah!" I think that's Rossi. And it just goes into, this solo that's got some force behind it. And I love the little flourish, little reminiscence of Rockin' All Over the World in there. Almost very cheeky, but like with rock and roll, it just lifts the rest of the track. You've got an energy going through to the end. And I've always liked that one. So let's go on to the next question. Daniel asks, what's your favorite guitar used by any member of the band? That's a tricky one, and I'm going to be really obvious, but I've always loved Francis Green Telly, because that was the image we were sold as fans. The image of Francis playing the green telly, Rick playing the white telly. And yet, it's funny, as a guitar player, I am more Rick than I am Francis. I am more a rhythm player. I mean, Francis has said at times he's just a rhythm player who plays lead occasionally, but I am more a Rick than a Francis. But I love the design of Francis' guitar. I know it was almost kind of accidental, the hole in it, but the shade of green that has always appealed to me. It just looks iconic. It's just an iconic looking guitar. As for anything else, I love the black, I think it's Ovation guitar that Rick plays on 4,500 times live at the NEC. That's always a nice looking instrument, very shiny. But yeah, for me, it's always been the Rossi Green Telly. I'm sorry that it's not a more obscure answer than that. But when I used to see them, say, on Top of the Pops or whatever, or on TV shows, the moment you saw Francis, it's like, there he is playing the green guitar. There are bands out there, obviously, that have that thing where, like, the instrument they play is also synonymous with everything else. Like, it's part of the image. Can you name any other bands that are like that? Because I was struggling to think of anything else. I guess Brian May's Red Special is one that stands out to me in terms of that, but I'm sure there are many others. Here's a last couple from Terry asking, who has been your favorite guest and why? That is such a tricky question. I can't possibly answer like my absolute favorite, because they're all like memorable in their own way. I love the way that each one is different, that they all go off in their own directions, and there's always something to like about the various directions that they go in. If I had to pinpoint ones that like stick in my mind at this moment, it would have to be like John Eden, very early in the podcast's life. Just hearing about all the production and stuff was really interesting. Chris Fernihue, for personal reasons, great to talk to him about our love of Quo, of being of a similar age. And, I'd known him for years. So to be able to bring him into something like that was really special to me. People connected with the band, such as Ty Coates, Andy Brooke, who's going on tour with Francis very soon. There's just so many. Dave Field, to hear about the birth of one of the most iconic album covers of all time was just really cool. Then there's all the tribute bands from Ray from Status Quo. Most of the members, or all of the members of Quode at various points. Big Fat Mama, which I still get comments about. Mick Hughes from Quo Connection. Baz Barry. I love, all of them. They're all memorable, and in some ways my favorite in some way. I know that's such a cop-out answer, but at this point, that is how I feel. Terry adds here, also, who haven't you interviewed that you always wanted to, Quo or non-Quo related? My first answer to this question refers to somebody who is no longer with us. I would have loved to have interviewed Rick Parfitt. That goes without saying, really, doesn't it? Because I tried to book an interview about maybe 15 years ago, but I wasn't in the media position that I am now. I was at some station or other, and their management replied back with, well, they're a bit busy right now. And I can understand, and I've tried at other times during that period. And what I got back was like a question about relevance. And that was very true. I wasn't really in a relevant kind of show or thing at that time compared to now. And so I understand why that didn't happen. I would have liked to have interviewed Alan Lancaster again with an updated perspective. I would say I know a lot more about Quo now than I did in 2011 when I first interviewed him. As for people who are still with us, I mean, Pete Kircher would be really interesting to hear how he adapted to the Quo mold back in the early 80s. Pip Williams, hearing about how he scored some of those 1980s albums and his contribution to it. Bob Young. I mean, I would, if Bob said, I want to come on every week for a month, I would, because we'd have plenty to talk about from Quo and non-Quo, just to have I know how much of a fan of country music he is. I'd love to talk to him about all of that and how that inspired his work. There are just so many people, really, aren't there? Mickey Moody, who's worked with Bob for many years. That is such a difficult question to answer. Non-Quo related, I'm going to assume like people connected, but at the same time, there are people non-Quo related. To touch on what I did at the beginning of the question, the late Tony Slattery, who passed away recently, just as an interviewer, I would have loved to have talked to him about his influences in comedy. I'm watching him in Whose Line Is It Anyway at the moment, and he was a genius. And it would have been interesting to find out if he was a Quo fan. It would have been interesting to have him on here to talk about that. That would have been something cool. It's mainly like, for me, as an interviewer, a lot of people in the animation industry, Nick Park is one that I'd love to have a chat with at some point. In addition to that, TV presenters, I interviewed Fred Dinage about 5 years ago, and that was the honor of my life. He was a huge influence on me growing up, and to be able to speak to him was amazing. I have so many people that I would like to interview. It never stops. The only thing that stops me from interviewing these people sometimes is my confidence. And I have to be honest and say that, it is my confidence that stops me, because, you have to reach out to these people, and sometimes they say no. And those no's are huge, crushing blows to me. A few people have said no to me, which I can understand. It's not the right time. Sometimes these things can wait. Lastly, to round off that question, Andy Bown. No more could be said there, really, can it? Thank you to those people who have submitted questions to me. If you'd like to submit a question for the future, then just leave it in the comments below. What are your thoughts? How would you answer any of these questions? Do let me know in the comments below.